And now, abundance, prosperity, and deregulation. Please welcome Isaiah Taylor, moderating with Jan Sramek and David Trulio.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, so I think this is the distance here for figuring this out. Thank you for coming. This is a panel about abundance, prosperity, and deregulation. Over the last 50 years, the size of the Code of Federal Regulations has grown rapidly and massively, and yet we've been building less and less. And so we want to take some time today to try to diagnose that and figure it out. I have some really exciting panelists here with me today. I'll give some really quick intros, but you probably know these guys and we'll launch in. Dave Trulio is experienced policy executive spanning government, media, and nonprofit. He's the CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, leading Ronald Reagan's legacy across public affairs, education, and policy. He was a former special assistant to the president and executive secretary of the Homeland Security Council under President George Bush. He was chief of staff and undersecretary for defense policy at the Pentagon, and spent some time at both Pentagon and Exim Bank under President Trump as well. He was also managing editor and head of strategy at Fox News and held senior roles at Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. Super excited to have you here, Dave. Jan Sramek is a former Goldman Sachs trader, and for the last 10 years he's been working on a really cool project called California Forever, where they've raised over $1 billion from Andreessen Horowitz, Mike Moritz, John Doerr, Laurene Powell Jobs, and I think you've got over 100 square miles north of San Francisco in a new city focused on making it possible to manufacture things in America. You should go check it out. So it's a super cool property. So I wanted to set the scene here a little bit and talk about what has happened in the regulatory landscape in the United States over the last 50 years. And Dave, your group has done a lot of research on this exact topic. What have you guys found?
Well, I think we would all agree that 406,000 regulatory restrictions is a lot of restrictions, but that number, as you can see on the slide, goes back to 1970. So then roll in a 270% increase that takes us up to 2019. So that's a really staggering amount of regulatory restrictive increase in my lifetime. And the result of that is a decrease in prosperity. Right? If restrictions had basically been held to 1980 levels, we would probably be about 25% higher in terms of our prosperity. And what that really means on a very practical level, it's about $13,000 per person. That's how much poorer we are because of this regulatory overload. Now, add to that, though, there is one important source of prosperity that regulation creates, and that has to do with one place, Washington, D.C., and I think this visual really says it all. This is the impact of that. 4 out of the top 6 highest income counties in the United States are not in California, they're not in Texas, they're not in Florida, they're not in Tennessee where all that dynamism is. They're in the Washington, D.C. area. Only 2 out of the top 6. And I would submit that that is not a recipe for American prosperity, especially given the challenges we face this century.
So DC's gotten a lot bigger. And what about the rest of the United States? Has the rest of the United States sort of grown to the same level? Are we building new things? Are we making more? Are we making less? Jan, I'm curious to know, you started California Forever partially to fix this problem. What did you see that made you go and do that?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to California in 2013, 2014, just as arguably the social fabric began to break down because we couldn't build anything. We couldn't build factories. We started losing employers. We couldn't even build office towers, actually, which is shocking. We started losing population because we couldn't build housing. And I thought that it was profoundly sad for the state that used to define optimism and dynamism in America to do that. And I like to think of it in terms of looking at some of the things that we used to be able to do and asking, could we do them again? And I want to give a few examples. So the Empire State Building was built in 366 days. The Pentagon, the whole thing, was built in 490 days. My favorite example, shipbuilding is a big topic in the country right now. The first nuclear submarine, from an idea to being in the water with sailors on it, was done in 3 years. 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy telegraphed the Bechtel company in the Bay Area, and they asked them to build a new shipyard. The telegram arrived on 2nd of March. They chose the site on the 3rd of March. They went to DC on 9th of March. 10 minutes into the presentation, the Navy stopped them, told them to stop talking and get back to California and build the goddamn shipyard. The first ship rolled off in September. It was 197 days. Boeing 747, you could say this was all wartime, and because of it there were no regulations. Boeing 747, which is one of the marvels of engineering in the 20th century, which still flies passengers to this day, went from an idea to flying fare-paying passengers in 4 years. The factory in Everett was still being built when they started assembling the first plane. Does anyone think we could do any of these things right now? Maybe in double the time, triple the time? No way. And so that's what we started working on to fix. And I think regulation is not the sole cause of that, but it's definitely a big factor. So we're building a new city in California. The environmental impact report for the city, if I stacked it from the floor, it would go up to about here. I think it's estimated right now, it's in the works, but it's estimated to be about 15,000 pages. And so actually, in preparation for this, I went down and I looked for something that I want to show you, which is this. CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Law, was passed in California in 1970. You know what this is? This is the first ever environmental impact report that was admitted and produced. It is all of 29 pages. You can't see it. 26 of the pages are images. They're just drawings. It's for a freeway interchange. If you try to build this today, you would spend about $60 to $100 million on an environmental document between CEQA and NEPA.
And that's why all these people on the slide are making so much money. The regulatory engine as opposed to the innovation engine.
Exactly. And so I think our perspective is not that we should have no regulations. I think there's a very important role for it, and we'll talk about it. But I think this just shows how far we've gone, and I think we need to roll it back at least a little bit.
So I want to dig into that a little bit. What is the proper role of regulation in a society, right? We know that we need regulations. Every time there's a society that's building real things in the real world, you have physical dangers to the society that you're building it in. There have been plenty of examples in the 20th century and in the 19th century of large-scale projects that have gone awry and have hurt the general public. So how do we strike that balance as a civilization? What is driving getting worse, right? Like, why are we getting worse over time at building things? What is the proper balance? How do we do that?
I think we need a clear sense of costs and benefits and time, and we need to factor those into all these decisions. So one idea that really we need to embrace much more deeply is basically regulatory budgets, right? So establish what is the right level of regulation overall, and what are we willing to accept from a time and cost standpoint, and then force the regulatory state to live within that, right? Then there are concepts like shot clocks, or essentially set times for decisions so that things can't drag out, right? How long has your project been going on, right? And I mean, it's not like you started and you knew by a certain time you would get an answer, even if it was an answer you didn't like, right? So I think those are basics. I think we would all agree we need good rules, but striking that right balance is what makes it so hard.
I think a quick kind of historical detour here is useful. And so I think part of the problem that we've created is, so NEPA was passed in '69 and then CEQA in 1970. And those are procedural laws for those people who are very lucky in their life and they don't have to spend time thinking about them. The way they basically work is they don't say what you can do and what you can't do. They just say you have to study and you have to disclose all of the impacts to inform the decision making, which is a good idea in principle. But obviously it started with 29 pages and some diagrams, and it ended up with 12,000 pages of analysis, which is not the case just for our project, by the way. The California High-Speed Rail is estimated to have spent $1 billion on environmental analysis. $1 billion to write a bunch of reports that largely no one will ever read. So what we did is we passed those laws, but then in 1972 we passed or 1970 we passed the Clean Water Act, or updated it, 1972 Clean Air Act, 1973 Endangered Species Act. And so what we did is we passed a series of laws that basically set up objective standards. And so they said, you cannot emit more than X, you cannot pollute the water, you cannot take these species. And then we continued setting up these objective standards for the next 40 years. But we never went back and said, hey, now that we have these objective standards, maybe we don't need to all of this procedural stuff that takes years and years and years. We could simplify that because we have objective rules in place about what you can do and what you can't do that we didn't have in the beginning. And so the balance between those two is what we need to adjust.
And we're piling things on and not looking back and saying, is it time to get rid of some of these requirements? You mentioned aviation and aircraft. In my lifetime, 50 years, aircraft has not taken big leaps. Think of what it was like from 1920 to 1970 in aviation. And then think of 1970 to now, basically. It's radically more incremental. And Blake Scholl from Boom Supersonic tells a great story about the 1970s, and the FAA basically banned supersonic flight. But what that effectively did is it banned speed, right? Because with that, it banned progress in flight, because the problem was audible sonic booms, not people going past the sound barrier. And that essentially kneecapped our ability to innovate and take leaps on aviation. That's the problem.
So I think entrepreneurs understand this naturally, right? Capital allocators are starting to understand this. It seems like if you talk to people around the room, especially in industries like aerospace, industries like nuclear, my own industry, people have recognized, like, okay, we've gone overboard in terms of regulation. We're not building things anymore. How does the American public feel about this? You know, is this actually something that the average person on the street understands, or is the average person on the street saying, yeah, you know, I don't know about nuclear reactors, I don't know about these, you know, large jet aircraft with sonic booms. How does the public feel about this?
Well, there is some encouraging news, and with thanks to my Reagan Institute team here in Washington, D.C., and Dan Rothschild, who's here, who was at the tip of the spear there is some very encouraging news. So here you see that a solid majority of Americans, 55%, the circled number there, they overall want policies that favor innovation over stability. And stability is basically trying to hold on to 20th century jobs in the 21st century. So this is the idea that there's some kind of consensus that we should slow innovation to have more short-term economic stability is just not borne out by the data. So I think this is certainly encouraging. And then especially here, when you see the differences by education, when it comes to education levels, the policy preference for innovation versus stability is not a working class versus a laptop class type issue. Those with a high school education actually are more likely than the average American to favor that bias towards innovation over stability. And I think the most mind-blowing insight from the Reagan National Economic Forum survey, you see it right here. This is President Reagan's very famous statement: government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Well, a whopping number of Americans, 76% overall, agree with that statement. And even if you look at Democrats, by a 22-point margin, they agree with that. So that, to me, is an encouraging sign that there's a baseline of support for embracing common sense reforms.
What are the consequences if we don't get this right? Right. I think that a lot of this Reindustrialize conference is about trying to build things again because, frankly, China is kicking our ass, right, in a lot of categories. But, you know, we're all making money. We're all doing pretty well. We're, you know, living in houses and going to work, and like things feel pretty fine and stable mostly. What happens if we continue going down this track? Where do we get?
Well, we're a lucky group. We get to come to Detroit for Reindustrialize, but large swaths of our country don't get to do this, and they're suffering, and they'll never get that chance unless we change course. But ultimately, this is a moral imperative, right? Growth, innovation, and opportunity ultimately is a moral imperative because it's a source of dignity for people, and it enables us to compete effectively on the global stage. Listening to the discussions on this stage, even today, just over the course of today, really bears that out. And I think the discussion we had earlier in the day around energy, about really thinking about energy not just as a commodity, but as a necessity for global competition and for advancing our way of life, is really crucial. I mentioned it briefly earlier. We would be about 25% richer as a nation if we had held regulatory restrictions to 1980 levels. And it's literally costing us and affecting us in our way of life.
I mean, I would add to it, I think a lot of the social friction, a lot of the conflict that you see in society, a lot of the people who are deeply dissatisfied with the status quo, a lot of it comes down to, do you believe that your kids are better off than you are? Like, ultimately, that's how people measure progress. I think for the last 150 or 200 years, if you looked at kind of either actual surveys or just the sense in society, people distinctly felt that was the case. And I think right now, in the last 15, 20 years, we have the first generation that is not distinctly better off than their parents. And it's very hard to believe in the future. It's very hard to be optimistic about society when that isn't the case. And what that leads to is zero-sum politics, zero-sum mindset. And I think that you look at all of the infrastructure that we have, and we're sitting at a pretty distinct cliff. I mean, to some sense, life is still pretty good because we're sitting on the shoulders of what our forefathers built, right?
We're flying in 747s.
Yeah, we're flying 747s. We're driving on the interstate highway system. We're taking power from nuclear power plants built 50 years ago. We literally are not capable of rebuilding the society that we live in today. If somehow you wiped off the slate physically, but we kept the regulatory system that we have in place today, and we had to resettle America and rebuild not build a better America, just build the very thing that we have.
The same one that we have now.
We absolutely could not do it. And I don't mean marginally couldn't do it. We would be living around fireplaces if we had to deal with around bonfires and in hats with animal skills on top of them, if we had to go through CEQA to build housing in California. I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but it's the case. Imagine you wipe off the physical slate of the country, and you have the same people who are here land in today, and they land in with today's regulations and laws. How long it would take to rebuild the country? 200 years? Maybe? And we would have to have 15 revolutions and 5 famines before then. We are unable to rebuild the civilization that we live in today, and it's not even close.
And add to that the tremendous misallocation of talent, right? So people, very, very smart people, are spending time focused on compliance, right? Focused on circumvention as opposed to innovating. Again, going back to why those rich counties are around the Washington, D.C. area. So that's that could mean that there's a medical discovery that won't be made that could cost you your life, right?
I have a very specific example of this that's very personal. So about 10 years ago, my mom was diagnosed with an eye condition, an eye disease, that meant that she was at a serious risk of losing her eyesight permanently. It was just the time as me and my wife were beginning to have kids. My mom had spent 30 years looking forward to having grandkids. That's all she wanted, was to play with her grandkids. And then she had this condition. Fortunately, there's a treatment for it now, and her eyesight is stable, and she's doing really well. If it was 20 years ago, she would have lost her eyesight within 2 years. 20 years ago. We got lucky by being 20 years older so that the cure had been invented. The irony is, the cure was invented by Genentech, as I learned later, manufactured in Vacaville in Solano County, where we're building the city. About 10 miles away. we had been buying up the land to build the city at that point, and then I learned that a factory in the county where we're building it was the first place that ever developed a cure for the eye disease, which is affecting tens of millions of Americans, hundreds of millions of people all over the world. And so when people talk about progress as a moral imperative, that's great. It's a very notional high idea. but it doesn't hit you in a very real way until you have a personal situation when a family member or a loved one or a friend is dealing with this. And you look at the progress that we see right now in cancer and immunotherapy and so on, and you consider how much further could we be along, and sometimes you say, well, we get it 20 years later, does it matter? Well, 20 years later might be the difference between your wife or your kid or your mother or your father dying or living another 40 years to see the next 2 generations of your family grow up. So it's pretty goddamn real. And I think these statistics have a real human cost that we've gone completely desensitized to, and we need to realize it again.
One of the examples here I like to challenge people with is imagine, and this is kind of similar to what you were saying before, imagine cars being invented in 2025, right? So imagine society as it is today, but with no cars, and then you have somebody say, hey, I've got this idea. I think we should all get into these steel boxes with wheels on them, and I think we should go 70 miles an hour.
Yeah, they could kill people.
Well, and not can they, but they will, in fact, kill a lot of people. And I think we should go 70 miles an hour, and if I want to go north and you want to go south, that's fine. We'll pass each other at about 5 feet apart. And by the way, 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds can drive them. I think that's a good idea. Let's do that, right? Imagine cars getting invented in 2025 American society.
Well, you need to study it for at least 10 years.
I don't think it would happen, right? I don't think that we would actually be able to take a technology like the automobile to market in not just the regulatory structure, but I fear that it's deeper than that. It's in risk tolerance, right? It's in our centralized system of DC authority that decides. We get in our rooms in DC and we decide how should the rest of the country operate, and the way that they make those decisions is very, very risk averse. Another example on this is nuclear reactors today. I have a nuclear company. We're building the first Gen 4 reactor, hopefully to turn on in the United States. The world's first reactor turned on in 8 months, right? And today, this would take 7, 8, 9, well, it hasn't happened yet, so who knows how long it would take in the United States, right? But the first one turned on in 8 months, and we had never, ever built it before. So I want to know from you guys, what do we do? Right, I think a lot of us in the room recognize the problem. We could not rebuild the society that we have today with the laws and the structures that we have in place, and that's a dangerous position to be in. What do we do? So I'm going to ask you the practical question, but first, let's ask a very impractical question just to suss this out a little bit, and that is, if you could repeal a single law in the federal government today, which law would you repeal? And tell us about that.
Well, I'm going to just jump in with the Administrative Procedure Act. So it turns 80 next year, and it's time to either permanently retire it or completely overhaul it. The costs are too high. The time involved is too long, and it's time for a new so-called constitution for administrative processes. And
Can you tell us real quick, what is the Administrative Procedure Act?
It basically establishes the rules and procedures that federal administrative agencies must follow when making regulations and issuing orders. And that's why it's so important that we really tremendously reform it, because if we don't, we're basically embracing Band-Aid solutions, right? There have been good faith efforts with statutes and EOs and so on, but this is really the core of it. And we need to improve the quality of the regulations that are issued, the analysis that accompanies it. We need to decrease the overall quantity and cost of those regulations. We need to empower states more, which are closer to many of these issues. And again, back to that concept of regulatory budgeting, putting out a total cap on the amount of cost and time that the overall regulatory burden is deemed to be acceptable, and then forcing everybody, including the regulatory agencies, to live within that.
You do realize that there was significantly decreased DC salaries, right?
They'll have to all move to Jan's community in California.
We need a lot of construction workers, so they're very welcome.
Jan, I'm not sure that they can all swing hammers, Jan. Well, we'll see.
I believe in
workforce education.
Jan, if you could repeal a single law from the federal government, which one would it be?
To slightly different answer, I would repeal a Supreme Court decision on Euclid. So in the early 19th century, the Supreme Court ruled that zoning was constitutional. So zoning is the idea that a local municipality gets to say what you get to do on your piece of property, which I think is deeply, deeply un-American. I mean, if you look at the history of the country, I think the founding fathers would be turning over in their graves if we had zoning. But it came largely from racist redlining. It came from the idea that people wanted to be able to keep brown people, black people out of their neighborhoods. That's how it was used in Berkeley, where it was first basically invented. I think that it makes sense to have regulations such as you can't build a chemical factory next to a school, but there's different ways to do those regulations that are based on some standards. The idea that if you own an acre, you can't decide whether you turn it into one house or 4 houses, or whether you build a kindergarten, or whether you build a general store to sell groceries, I think is deeply un-American, and we need to reform it. And I think even though it hasn't been repealed and maybe never will be, we've been slowly reforming it at a local level as cities have realized it, and they've relaxed zoning dramatically. And I think we need a lot more of that. By the way, the last thing that I say is what zoning has done is, if you look at most of the most beloved neighborhoods in America, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Charleston, Savannah, Philadelphia, old parts of San Francisco, they were all built before zoning. All of them, universally. We basically haven't built any amazing urban neighborhoods, with some exceptions, since zoning was invented. And so it's a clearly failed policy, and what it basically does is, let's separate out all of the components, residential there, commercial there, industrial there, which is kind of like saying the best way to eat a pizza is that you should first eat the flour, then drink the water, then you eat the salami, and then you add whatever else you want to put on it. So it's a ridiculous way to think about cities. Cities are these deeply integrated systems that benefit from being next to each other and not separating everything out in these buckets like a toddler who doesn't want to eat all of their food mixed together, so they separate it in little buckets.
So I'm going to ask you a similar question. And we have an audience here of policymakers and entrepreneurs and capital allocators and people who can apply the right pressure at the right time. So this is really intentional and really targeted to what can we do after we leave this room. Now, we can't go and repeal an individual law as a single individual, but we can advocate for these things. So my next question is, forgetting statutes for a moment, we have a lot of agencies of the federal government. And let's say you could be appointed czar of a single federal agency with no APA. So let's say your law has already been repealed, but there's no Administrative Procedures Act. You're the czar of a federal agency. You can write CFR. You can repeal CFR. Which agency is that, and what do you do?
Well, Secretary Chris Wright has spoken very eloquently about the frustrations and challenges associated with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So in the 3 decades following World War II, we built dozens and dozens and dozens of nuclear power plants. Then in January of 1975, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is established, and in the years that followed, we essentially have built 3. Right? So that on its face is a perfect illustration of the regulatory gridlock and huge challenges associated with something that is really hurting us and preventing our ability to take leaps as a nation, especially in a time of great consequence where energy, again, is a necessity, not a nice to have. So I would completely reform or transform the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
I'm not smart enough or legally educated enough to know exactly which agency and which CFR, but I think the broader answer is, I think we need to go back to individual responsibility at the level of the regulators. And so what I see when we deal with regulators, whether it's in California or in DC, is a lot of really smart people trying to do the right thing, but getting completely caught up in the system where there's one way to say, to get to a yes, you need 21 people to say yes, and any one of those people can veto it. And so I think we need a regulatory system where whoever we put in charge, we actually trust them to make the right decisions, and then bear the consequences of that with obviously safeguards and checks, and create a system where they need to look at the set of trade-offs. yes, if you build this freeway, you will need to build over 2 acres of wetlands. But if you don't build this freeway, 200,000 people are going to spend another 30 minutes in traffic every day for the next 50 years. And they are never going to see their kids for dinner because they are sitting in traffic because there's a 5-acre wetland in an area. And pollute the air in an area where we've got 50,000 other acres of wetlands. And so real life is complicated. There's trade-offs. And I think we've created a system that doesn't actually empower the people who are running these agencies to consider the trade-offs and make the right decisions overall.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming out today. This was an awesome chat. Thank you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.